Good evening. So I think, I understand I'm the only thing standing between you and Friday evening and a long weekend, perhaps. So thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to be here. Just before I get started, I just want to provide some backdrop to what I'm going to talk about. So I've been studying, observing, participating in media and digital issues for the last 19 years or so. It culminated in this book, The Content Trap, which is really around strategy and digital change as it relates to content, any business in the content space. What I'm going to talk about today is really going back to the roots of much of my work, which started with television advertising. So really talk about the implications of everything I'm writing in that book for the advertising world. In a sense, you can take the word content in that book and just replace it by the word advertising. And that's essentially the thrust of my talk. Okay? That's the book that I haven't yet written, and which I'll probably never write. But I just want to talk about that. Before I get into that, I was a little surprised last month when an old friend of mine sent me this photo from Delhi airport, which is probably the first airport that I've actually seen this. So thank you, Delhi. In fact, it's nice to be able to beat out De Villiers and Chris Gale on the book list. So the state of digital marketing today. Obviously, there's a lot of promise. There's a lot of opportunities. There's also many challenges. And I just wanted to capture some of these challenges as we have seen them, particularly over the last 6 months, right? You have there the Facebook issue, overstating video views, which has been going on for 2 years. Apple with ad blocking. And then more recently, P&G and one of its most senior executives talking about the obfuscation of online advertising. This is not what we predicted digital marketing to be 20 years ago, right? And so what I wanted to do is actually focus on some of these issues and talk about sort of how did we get here and what lies ahead. When you go back to the early 1990s, the promise was hyper-targeting and personalization. The promise was that digital advertising would more or less replace TV advertising, particularly with things like digital video recorders, which would allow ad skipping. And the promise was big data is going to help us on many, many, many dimensions. By the way, this is just a sample of predictions. Many of these have turned out to be fundamentally wrong. We have low CTRs, falling ad prices, which really impacts publishers, ad blocking. Television advertising in the US for broadcast TV has basically remained steady at $40 billion for the last 16 years, which is stunning to almost everyone. And finally, there's still debates about ad effectiveness online, which I'll get to. So what's going on? Before I even get to the talk, the first thing I'll just say is beware of predictions. We're not too good at making predictions. And so in some sense, what I'm going to talk about is history and strategy, which is what have we learned from essentially 25 years? That's a quarter century of digital marketing. And how might it inform what's going to come next? I want to start with a simple story. Does anyone know what this is? Newsprint. So this is newsprint. These are warehouses of just paper. And this was a particular plant in South Africa. I'd gone there, and I asked the plant manager, what is this room going to look like 10 years from now? What I thought I would get is a rousing defense of print. Instead, he comes up to me and whispers in my ear. He says, Bharat, I get all my news in the iPad. I was like, oh, come on. So what was the problem with newspapers? It's not a rhetorical question. What destroyed newspapers? Clearly electronic media. Why? We can get news from there. And why is online news better? It's instant, it's cheaper, it can be customized, it is rich media, it's green, and we can keep adding to this list. By the way, the latest is virtual reality. It's very rare to see a product which is so much better than the traditional product in so many different dimensions. And so if you look at the implications of this for print readership and how has that changed, it's pretty dismal, okay? This is print readership circulation per household over time. It's basically dropped by about 70 to 80%. Except I forgot the time axis on this chart, which anyone who looks at this might think that if we added in time, you'd probably have the internet kicking in around the left side of the axis, right? That's when this decline starts, which is actually not the case. So this is pretty stunning. This starts with radio 70 years ago, then black and white TV, then color TV, then cable TV, then cable news 24/7, and finally the internet. By the way, here's what's amazing. The impact of the internet on newspaper readership is empirically indistinguishable from everything that came before it. Wow. Okay, so what's the real problem? As we now know, the problem wasn't with news content. The problem was the internet destroyed classified advertising. This is over the last 20 years. Circulation per household declines are offset by price increases, so revenues are roughly stable. That's the red line, circulation revenues. Retail advertising, which are those big page 3 ads you see, that declines. Classifieds drops by about 90% for almost all the major brands. Now, it's a little puzzling because on the face of it, online news and online classifieds have exactly the same advantages. But why is it that in one case, consumption declines are fairly sort of narrow and small, and in the other case, they are massive? This goes to a fundamental issue, which I'm going to talk about, which is how we make these consumption decisions. When you and I consume news, it's basically one by one. I don't care if 30 of my friends like Google or Times of India or CNN.com. If I like the NewYorkTimes.com, I'll go to the NewYorkTimes.com. I'm making my decision based on quality and price. That is not the case with classified advertising. Which classified site do I go to? I go where there's the most listings. Oh, where do the sellers go to list? Where there's the most buyers. More buyers, more sellers, more sellers, more buyers. You start having these feedback loops. These feedback loops are often called network effects. Once you win the network, you essentially win the entire market. Meaning you're not fighting for 35 versus 39% market share, you're fighting for 95 share. Similarly, when you lose classifieds, you don't go from 95% like newspapers did to 90%, you go all the way down to 0. All right, the basic difference between the left and right model is that the left model is all about consuming things one by one. The right model has this feature of connectedness. Connectedness, I'll argue, is endemic to digital worlds. It's such an obvious observation, and yet we miss it completely. It has profound implications for many things we do. And I'd love to actually spend some little time talking about what these are. So the dynamics of advertising, in particular classified advertising, is what destroyed newspapers, not content. This is part one of the content trap. All right, what I'd love for you to do when you think about digital is think about these two worlds. These two worlds capture the tension between the analog or the traditional and the digital worlds. The left side is essentially a hub and spoke model. It's essentially a broadcast model. We produce things, we sell it to people one by one. We create an ad, we reach customers one by one. The right side is what we might call a platform model, where all you're doing is essentially matching buyers and sellers. And you're hoping these feedback loops turn out to be positive. So where do we see this? We actually see this everywhere in digital worlds. The biggest battle, personal computers, Microsoft versus Apple for 30 years. Guess what? Microsoft had, by all accounts, the worst quality product, and it won the entire market. Apple ends up with 3% share because Microsoft won the network. Why did we buy a PC? Because we wanted to share files with each other. Once you get the installed base, more app developers, more users, and so on and so forth. By the way, here's what's interesting. We've just seen the greatest corporate transformation in history by Apple over the last 15 years. Its market share in PCs globally has gone from 3% to about 7%. Barely moved. It's won in all these other areas. Microsoft still remains basically untouched in PCs. Google versus Facebook. Facebook has the social network. I don't know if anyone remembers Google Plus when it came out. It's actually a pretty nice product. In fact, most people said it's got many more features than Facebook. Until someone said, there's no one else playing in the sandbox but me. Product quality is essentially irrelevant. Once you win the network in these markets, you win the game. When eBay wins in marketplaces around the world, it wins big. When it loses, like in Japan and China, it doesn't go from 80 to 75%. It goes all the way down to 3% and exits. Airbnb. More people who list their homes there, more people will rent, more renters, more listers. This is a tweet from an Airbnb executive. It's a pretty rude tweet, so I'd suggest you don't tweet like that. All the rude tweets have become the norm over the last 18 months. That's basically the same idea of connectedness. This is Uber. When Uber starts with black cars, its own cars, it's growing nicely, the black line. When it opens up to third-party partner drivers, it grows exponentially. If you want the masterclass in thinking about connectedness, here's a company, actually, Tencent. I don't know if how many of you have heard about this. One of the biggest pure-play internet companies in the world, located in China. Their history is a history of exploiting connected decisions. They start with instant messaging, move from there to social networks, to microblogs, and finally to WeChat, right? By the way, here's what's interesting. Just compare Facebook and Tencent. Both have about $10 billion or so, maybe $16 billion now in revenue. Both market cap, about $250 billion. Both have over 1 billion users. Here's the difference. Facebook, over 90% of its revenues from advertising. Tencent, about 15% of its revenues from advertising. How do they do it? Oh, they actually sell all these virtual goods. On the instant messaging system, everyone has a number. We want to differentiate ourselves from using this number from each other. What do? You get these emojis, avatars. I want to buy a virtual Gucci shirt for my avatar to stand out from the crowd. I pay 99 cents. All you need is 5% of China to pay this. You have this market cap, right? So that's what's going on with Tencent. Here's the critical issue, which is these kinds of networks can be created. I'm actually pretty proud of this example. I thought about it before last summer, which was Pokemon cards. Predates Pokemon Go by about 2 decades. There's nothing on this card which says it's a connected product. Oh, but they go to great lengths to convince you and me that the value of the card lies in trading with your friends. And then I don't want to be the only kid in school who doesn't have the card, right? Friends and family plans. This was a personalized reader from the Washington Post. Nice technology, sort of goes nowhere. Then they optimize for Facebook. They get 19 million users within 6 weeks. And then Facebook changes its algorithm. All right. The point here is if you want growth, you use the model on the left. If you want exponential growth, you use the model on the right. That's essentially the difference between analog and traditional models. So 2 messages. The best digital marketing strategy is to spend no money on digital marketing. Think about how much money Facebook spends on marketing itself. 0. Once they win the network, their users effectively become their sales force. So in digital worlds, marketing strategy is fundamentally tied to product strategy. Think about all these companies that have won networks. They spend almost nothing on marketing. The second thing is the best quality product, quote unquote, and you can replace that word by content or advertising, need not win. This was the mistake of Apple and PCs. This was the mistake of Google Plus and social networks. We see this in advertising too, by the way. This is just a recent example. I actually quite like this. This was 2 years ago at the US Super Bowl, 2015. Super Bowl, obviously the event when everyone actually buys ads. JCPenney, struggling to reinvent its brand. They said, we're not going to buy any ads on TV. This was their first tweet during the game, 5 minutes into the game. Who knew this was going to be a baseball game? Except there's all these spelling mistakes. Right after they posted this, there was chatter on the internet. Do these guys even know how to do social media? Is there some drunken intern who's actually managing their Twitter handle? 10 minutes later, there's another tweet. Tough down Seahawks. Is Seattle going to run away with this? Again, many spelling mistakes. Now this goes viral. In fact, their competitors started retweeting this tweet. Their third tweet came half an hour later. They said, oops, sorry for the typos, tweeting with mittens, and they had a picture attached to this. Wasn't it supposed to be colder? They were the official sponsor for the US Winter Olympic team for their mittens. This turns out to be the second most mentioned brand on social during the 2015 Super Bowl. The amount of money they spent was zero. The best ad creatively need not win. You can do this like really cheap. Now that's the good news. It also turns out there's this slightly darker side, right? Which basically has to do with the fact that these feedback loops from advertiser to consumer aren't always positive. So we've all seen these, right? In fact, this is now becoming video. This is becoming pre-roll. This is becoming scrolling. The question is, as long as I can get like 1 or 2 or 3% to click and sell the product, does it matter? So here's essentially a question, a big question. When it comes to advertising, the reverse loop from advertisers to consumers need not be positive. It could easily be negative, as that example shows. And the question is, does it matter? So we ran an experiment recently. Here's what we did. We gave 900 people an article to read. It was about the Greek crisis. The original article appeared in the Huffington Post. What we did was we created 3 websites. One which looked like this with no brand name. The second group saw the same article on a site that looked like The Economist. The third group saw the same article on the original Huffington Post site. Now, of course, the people who are watching the article don't know that they're being randomized. The other thing we did is also inserted ads. So for each group, 1/3 got no ads to see. Another third saw these beautiful ads from Gucci and American Express. And the last third saw these irritating pop-up ads. The only question we asked them, and again, they don't know they're being randomized. The question we asked them is, read the article. What do you think is the editorial quality of this article from a scale of 1 to 10? That's the only question we asked them. Here's what they answered. So this is the no ad baseline. For the unbranded website, 1/3 of the people rated 1 to 4 out of 10. For The Economist, it's exactly the opposite. Almost half the people rated 8 to 10. HuffPo comes somewhere in between. By the way, these differences are massive. Okay? That's the brand effect. By the way, a lot of people say, oh, we have a great brand. How do you know? Oh, Interbrand tells me that. And then you start peeling the onion. How does Interbrand get its data? And you soon realize this is slightly problematic. If you really want to figure out the strength of your brand, here's the way to do it, which is literally isolate the brand effect from the quality effect. This is exactly the same content, and they still think there's a difference in quality. That's only to do with the brand. What about the advertising effect? So this was for the unbranded website. For people who saw no ads, roughly they rated a 5.4. People who see the nice ads, they actually think the article is better. By the way, that's also the case, to some extent, for the crappy ads. Why is this? Oh, the perception might be, I'm seeing an ad on this website. Someone's paying to list there. It must be decent. So when I don't have any signal on quality, ads actually help. How does it look for The Economist, though? For people who saw no ads versus people who see the really nice ads, almost no difference in editorial perception. I see those pop-ups. My perception of editorial quality goes down. This is why it matters. For the Huffington Post, almost no effect. By the way, there was a really interesting question we also asked them. We said afterwards, did you see an ad? For the Economist and the unbranded website, pretty much everyone who saw an ad had perfect recall. For the Huffington Post, about 1/3 of the people said they saw an ad when in fact there was none. Why? Because we're basically just confusing it with pictures and video and so on. This is the reason why these negative feedback loops matter for publishers. So if I think that my customer is the advertiser, sorry, you're out of luck. There's only one real consumer, and that's the end user. We've got to think hard about that as well. This is the state of things today. 50 to 70% of users reported very negative associations with pop-ups. And in spite of that, we have statements like this from the IAB. This is even more depressing from Cisco's annual report a couple of years ago. Okay. All right. So what's going on? This is the advertising trap, if you will, which is we only focus on the bottom feedback loop as opposed to the top. The question is, how can we make sure that we actually have a great experience while also doing marketing? Now, that seems like a tough question. Let me come back to content and pose an even tougher question, which is, how do content companies actually think about creating this connection? This is a company you've probably not heard about. It's Schibsted. It's a media company in Norway, Scandinavian media company. They're generally regarded as one of the most successful Western media companies to transition online. How do they do it? They actually first saw the classifieds dynamic. Around the year of the dot-com crash, 2000, all newspapers are throwing a party and pulling out of the internet, saying, we told you so, there's no money to be made here. They actually go aggressively online because they see this winner-take-all dynamic. They win in Norway, they win in Sweden, then they go to France. Today, they're globally #1 in classifieds. It's a cash machine which they use to reinvest in their news product. Here's what's even more interesting. This mindset infiltrates their newsroom. How? So I don't know if you remember this volcanic ash crisis about 6 years ago. Iceland spreads over Europe. What do you think was the most popular article on the Schibsted websites during that crisis? So weather. When is this thing going to move away? What are the health implications? What are the geological formations that give rise to this? Might it happen again? Those are the obvious suggestions. It turns out none of this. What they see are users posting messages on the website very early on. All air travel was disrupted. Users basically asking, how do we get from point A to point B? Someone replies, oh, I'm driving a car from Oslo to Trondheim. I can pick up 3 people at the train station at 3 o'clock. What they do is they go to their IT team with this question. How can we help readers help each other? Not what's the best content or article. Their IT team creates an app within 7 hours. It's called Hitchhiker Central. All it was doing was essentially allowing people to share messages with each other. This was easily the most read, quote-unquote, content during the crisis. That's the question they now ask themselves during every major crisis. What happens to engagement? It's actually 2 to 3 times as high as that for a typical newspaper. Online CPMs on their website, as high as print CPMs, which is unheard of, right? This is essentially building connections. How might you do that in advertising? We often talk about virality. By the way, the first thing is just start by reducing negative feedback loops, right? Just be sensitive to that. Virality and BuzzFeed, they optimize on sharing, not on the quality. Communities. Patagonia had this ad a few years ago. Very strange, right? They're basically telling you, don't buy our stuff. What they really mean is, don't buy a new jacket. Why? Because our old jackets last forever. That was essentially the message. And it's completely consistent with their orientation towards environment-friendly and green. But that's basically what they were saying. This is all about communities. Networks. How do we actually build ads that are both nice, consistent with the message, and get shared? Again, back to JCPenney, a couple of years ago during Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving, by the way, in the US has become one of those depressing, like, 3-day weekends when people used to shop, starting at noon, then it became 7 a.m. Now it's midnight the previous day. I mean, people literally dread it. And everyone is basically sending ads saying, here's the latest discount we're going to offer. JCPenney airs this ad. It was called Just Got Jingled. Essentially a series of video clips showing customers in their stores where they basically told customers, just go to any random stranger in the store and tell them you will buy something for them in the store. They can pick anything they want, and that's a gift from our behalf. It was all about giving as opposed to buying or receiving. At the end of these video clips, you literally have people crying. This goes viral, literally 3 million tweets within the first few days. Okay? So ad content versus connections. One of the messages really is thinking hard about not just how do we sell product, but about these feedback loops across the board. All right. The real message is don't just create to connect. Yeah? Great. Here's another story. The music industry, this is even more depressing than newspapers. This is what happened to CD sales starting in 1999. What was the trigger event? Napster. Napster launches 3 months before CDs start declining. Or that's the story we were told. Look at this chart and ask the question, what else could explain the decline in CD sales? Oh, there's one obvious culprit, which is the format substitution. The only thing that happened was formats changed from CDs to digital formats. If that story were true, how might we test it? It turns out there were previous format changes within the industry. We can look at the decline from vinyl to cassette and cassette to CDs and see how fast they looked. We went out and got this data. Here's what it looks like. By the way, even those squiggly lines are the same, but they're actually different data sets. Now, if I look at this data set, what am I saying? The culprit is piracy. Let me get the best lawyers in the room and make sure we kill this problem. By the way, getting lawyers is not a bad thing if you have the right diagnosis. If this is the culprit, the only question we must ask is how can we make money in the new format, right? This idea of separating cause from effect is a problem that plagues many, many issues, and in particular, as I'll talk about later, even the question of advertising effectiveness. Just to stick to this for a second, so how might you make money in the digital format? Oh, blank CDs, CD burners, those sales exploded early on. Broadband internet advertising, the demand for that exploded. Why? Because 30% of the backbone infrastructure of the internet is used for file sharing of music and movie files. Just as Warner Music is suffering, their sister division Time Warner Cable is enjoying its best decade. Sales of MP3 players and hardware. And the last one is concerts. The price of concerts started exploding right about the time that file sharing kicks in. Why? 30 years ago, concerts were priced low. They were essentially an advertisement for you to go and buy the CD. Now that we can't control the price of music, that relationship flips. Free music is essentially the ad for you to go to the live concert, which we can't pirate. By the way, the artists like this. On a $15 CD, they captured only $1. On a $1 ticket, every dollar of gate receipts, they take home 70 cents. Estimates are that artists' incomes have remained roughly flat during the last 15 years, and for those at the very top have actually increased. This is why you often hear, people like Beyonce and Lady Gaga and Shakira saying, when you ask them, what do you think about piracy? They're like, we sort of don't care. Now, the real tragedy is in 1999, Universal Music, which was the largest recording studio, sells its concert business. Why? Oh, we're seeing a decline in the core business. Everyone says, focus on your core. That's core competence thinking. Get rid of everything else. Core competence thinking leads you in exactly the wrong direction when you're facing a declining market. These are things we call complements. Complements are anything where the availability of a complement increases demand for your core product. I want to think more expansively about these businesses, not less expansively. The black line here is CD sales. If you're just in that business, you're doomed. There's nothing you can do. And then we've simply added digital without subscription-based streaming, without broadband internet access, concerts, and MP3 players. The music industry is in pretty good shape. It's just that value got redistributed. OK, where else do we see these things of complements? Hot dogs and ketchup, cars and roads. Oh, think about a tire manufacturer that tells us where the best gourmet restaurants are. By the logic of core competence, the Michelin executives should be fired. There is nothing to do with making tires when it comes to telling you about great food. Oh, but I'm going to tell you about those restaurants 300 miles away in the south of France, and you've got to drive. Movie theaters in the US and Europe, they are now doubling their price of their tickets, offering the same movies, same greasy popcorn, still completely sold out. Why? They're starting to offer childcare services right next door. We go to the movies, we get married, we go to the movies. At some point, we essentially stop going to the movies when we have kids. It is so hard to get babysitting. They contract with third parties to offer this next door. Complements thinking moves you in the other direction. This is the battle between digital giants. right? When we think about Apple makes most of its money on hardware. They want software and content to be cheap. Microsoft, exactly the opposite, make the money on software. We want content and hardware to be cheap. Google and Facebook, the emerging advertising duopoly, make almost all their money on advertising. We want content, software, and hardware to be cheap. Right? If you're stuck in the middle, that's not a nice place to be. Now, replace this chart by just putting ad agencies at the center. That's also not a nice place to be. Why? Because ads and ad space are wonderful complements. If I'm selling you ad space, I want to make sure it is super easy for you to make ads. In fact, I'll make ads for you and give it away to you. And then you pay me for renting the ad space. Guess who's building internal ad agency-like capabilities? All these guys. So complements. Recognize when your core business is someone else's complement. That's the time you better wake up. Okay? All right. This is the history of complements. We often think, in fact, these are substitutes. When radio first came along, the entire recording studio industry tried to kill it. Why? We think free music is going to kill music. It turns out it's the best thing that happened. It's just a promotion. MTV and music, VCR and movies, every time a new technology comes along, we think it's going to destroy our core business. It turns out to help it. By the way, the same for DVRs and advertising. DVRs came along, and we thought people are just going to skip ads. In fact, they did. And then the most effective studies, the most careful studies of how DVRs actually affect product purchase, which is the question you want to ask, showed that there's no relation between DVR and non-DVR households and product purchase. What's the reason for that? You know, it turns out there was a way we could skip ads even before DVRs. As Jonah Peretti at BuzzFeed says, it was called the neck. The ad comes along, all I do is turn away from it. The only thing that's changed is we now observe ad skipping. It's not that it never existed. So just because we can observe behavior today with digital technologies doesn't mean this didn't exist earlier. And we're so obsessed with things like ad skipping, we forget that the real question is ad effectiveness or product purchase. All right, why do we get it wrong? Partly because of the mindset. We're so focused on product as opposed to customer and experience. But one other reason I think we get it wrong is data. What do I mean by that? Let me give you an example. This was actually the first study I did on TV advertising 20 years ago. We thought we were going to write a paper showing how the broadcast television networks were wasting money because out of every 6 minutes of commercial time, they spent 1 minute promoting their own shows. Now, the opportunity cost of that is large. That's a 16% ad to sales ratio. Figuring out the effectiveness is not that easy. Let's say Seinfeld on Thursday at 9 o'clock is airing ads in Frasier on Tuesday at 9. Even if you see people who watched Frasier see an ad for Seinfeld and then watch Seinfeld, we don't know whether that was the ad effect or whether they just like sitcoms. Right? Disentangling those two things is really hard. By the way, we had about 1,500 observations on different viewers. Let's say we had increased that to 1 million observations. It would not have helped this problem. You still are faced with the same fundamental problem. More data in this case doesn't help. So when we say, oh my gosh, we have so much data, now we can measure things, we can tell you more precise estimates, that's nonsense. Just as a footnote, there were different ways that we could actually estimate preferences. When we went back and did it, the paper that we wrote turned out to be exactly the opposite of what we thought we were going to write. The ads were, in fact, super effective. But we don't know that about digital marketing. So here's a really interesting question about paid search, right? Paid search, everyone says, is the most effective form of advertising, right? Here's the question that was being asked by some colleagues at Berkeley. So this was Steve Tidelis, who was the chief economist at eBay. They were clearly spending a lot of money bidding for the keyword eBay on Google. And then Steve asked this question. He said, hold on a second. Take this example. If I type in Macy's, and I see a paid link, right below that I see the organic search link. By the way, if the customer clicks on the top, Macy's is paying Google. When he clicks at the bottom, you're not paying them anything. Oh, so the question they asked was, doesn't organic search in principle substitute for paid search, particularly when it comes to branded keywords? Here's the experiment they ran. On Bing, they actually shut off bidding for eBay keywords. That's on the left. You literally see when it drops, there's a 1-for-1 substitution with organic search. And the same thing happened when they tried the same experiment on Google. Their conclusion, for branded keywords, paid search is essentially wasted money. By the way, this was published in the #1 leading economics journal. Obviously, Google was not a happy camper. They published a different report saying, no, it affects clicks. They were right. It does affect clicks. It doesn't affect sales. Now, it turns out, so eBay stops bidding for the eBay keyword after that. For non-branded keywords also, they had a separate study as part of this, where they showed effectively the returns were 0. This takes a lot of time for organizations to come to terms with. By the way, even we haven't acted on this. We are still bidding for the Harvard Business School keyword, despite all my pleas to my colleagues that we're basically just wasting money here. It is really hard to get out of this conundrum. But part of the point is, when it comes to measuring effectiveness, more data doesn't help. Data alone cannot separate cause from effect. And you've got to be super careful about this. This is a big black box in digital marketing. And there are some studies like this one which are starting to be more careful, but really we deserve much, much more of this, right? And the challenge is we either don't have the right data, or we don't have it by consumer, it's only by channel, as Nielsen used to collect, or the digital giants basically have the data and are unwilling to share it for this kind of work. All right. Context matters. What does that mean? Given everything I've said so far, this would be one of the natural implications. This is an article published in the New York Times. It was about female prison inmates. How many of us even think about women in prison? I mean, we don't even have that picture in mind. So it turns about a non-trivial share, roughly about 10% of people who are in prisons are women. And the question is, how do we deal with that? Because everything is optimized towards male inmates. This article was one of the 10 most read articles in the New York Times that month. This was paid content. This was sponsored by Netflix. There was no mention of Orange is the New Black series other than that little thing right at the top. The fact that people love this article is not a coincidence. It is completely integrated with the editorial or brand experience. Oh, the moment we say native, we almost have this cathartic reaction. It's like, this is the worst thing that happens to journalism. We've got to separate church and state. Yes, you want to maintain separation, but where has separation taken us? Basically, no one cares about the customer experience. To have the integrated consumer experience, you don't need church-state integration, but some church-state alignment might actually work. This is partly why the debate over native is so interesting and so frustrating to many. It's not just about the swindlers of journalism who are saying, oh, let's go native and fool consumers. It's also people who care deeply about journalism, who are saying, perhaps this might be one way to think about the answer to the challenges. I'll spend the last couple minutes just talking about a personal story, which gets me to my last point. About 5 years ago, we started facing our own digital tsunami at Harvard Business School. In fact, online is now hitting higher education in a profound way. What was the initial reaction? You had a bunch of platforms set up, Coursera, Udacity, edX, which said, let's just capture video content from the classroom, stream it online, you reach 100,000 people instantaneously. Why? Digital is all about reach. Well, it turns out, in fact, 100,000 people did sign up for these courses, except only about 1% completed them. Why? Well, if you're going to show me that same video of that boring faculty member in the classroom, it was torture enough to watch that person while sitting in the classroom. It's even more torture watching it online. Taking the same experience that we have in the offline world and simply porting it online is, of course, not digital first. So we actually decided to approach this a slightly different way. We said, how can we actually engage each and every user? Forget about reach. If we can't crack the code of engagement, reach is irrelevant. So we tried a few things. By the way, when we started out, we said, let's produce these great courses. 3 months into this project, I had a few MBA students working with me, and they came to me and said, Professor Anand, we don't just learn from the faculty in the classroom, we learn from each other. We learn in study groups. We learn in the gym conversations, in the lunch breaks. We had completely forgotten about social learning. Here's the scary part. I'm writing this book called The Content Trap, and we're falling into the content trap. We're thinking what people want is great content. We pivoted the project completely and started focusing on social learning. Here's what we did. Here's the first screen on what we now call the HPX platform. You can get online courses. There's no content. It's just a global map. You see who else is online. They're pulsating bubbles. You can click on these bubbles and actually start messaging people with their profile pictures. The first day, 300 students logged in. We had 13,000 profile views. It turns out they just want to check each other out. It's like the content comes later. All right, discussion boards. Most discussion boards fail in online media. When we produce articles in the New York Times, we say, here's the comment section. And then, of course, that becomes the haven for trolls. It turns out you've got to integrate this into the product itself. We also thought about giving incentives to people. In our case, we could do that. We said part of your grade depends on whether you help each other out on the discussion boards. As simple as that. First day, 75% of people move to the discussion boards. By the way, you might say, yeah, they might be giving answers. How do you know they're the right answers? So as you can imagine, we were also pretty scared about this. We had the content teams monitoring the discussion boards. The first 3 weeks, the number of times we had to intervene was essentially 0. These are people taking the course for the first time. They're answering their peers' questions in exactly the right way. It's very humbling, by the way. They don't need us. All they need is the fruit garden. You show them the fruit, and then they can navigate themselves. Then we started doing a little more funky things. We said instead of an assignment that says, here's your written answer to this question, we said just post a picture that best explains your answer to this question. And then we can create an Instagram type-like feature. It's very easy to see what other people are doing, and super easy and more interesting as well to engage with. The last thing we did is something called the online cold call. What does that mean? So in our classrooms, I might just call on someone. I might say, Dilip, what do you think of this issue? He suddenly gets scared. Oh my God, like I've got to pay attention. He also doesn't want to look stupid in front of his peers, right? It's a very effective lever in our classrooms. Here's what we did online. So Dilip is going through the course. Suddenly a pop-up appears at random. It says, Dilip, you've been cold called. You have a minute to answer this question. There's a clock ticking in the corner. 30 words or less. Your answer is visible to the entire cohort with your profile picture. They can't sit back now and just watch the content. They've got to engage. These are just different ways that we were thinking about engagement. It turns out it paid off. Completion rates for these courses, about 85 to 90%, even though we have very low faculty interaction. Here's the distribution of conversations worldwide. And the best part is we started seeing people having physical meetups in places like Mumbai, San Francisco, Tokyo, around the world. Who else is doing HPX? So let's actually meet up and form study groups. We then said, let's take that further. And we said, they know each other in their cohort. Let's connect all of them. We sent them one email last March. It was a crazy idea. We said, whoever's completed the course, if you want to come to campus for a day, just show up. We'll have a great series of events for you. 500 people showed up. They traveled from India, Australia, Denmark, Qatar, Kenya. By the way, they had completed the course. They didn't need anything from us. They showed up just to connect with each other. Now it starts giving you different ways of thinking about multi-platform education. But my key message is digital promises us reach. That's the intoxicant. That's the drug. By the way, that drug is even greater in markets like India, where you have 1 billion people. How do we describe consumers? Eyeballs. Oh, it turns out there's a whole other part of my body besides my eyeball, which is relevant. If we actually start thinking about the consumer and engage, it's not just reach, it's reach and engage. So this is not about content and advertising. At the end of the day, it's really about an existential question, which is we have got to be more consumer-centric. It's about content, consumers, and connections. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks a lot, Mr. Bharat. A befitting end indeed to AdTech 2017.